Okay, so let's go on. Let's talk about seed market and in particular seed laws. The international regulatory framework on the production, sharing and commercialization of seeds is rather complex. Can you explain how does it work at the international and local levels? In particular, could you help us better understand how does the UPOV convention work? And what are its main implications for big corporations, small farmers, and the agricultural system as a whole?
Okay, let's have some perspective first on what's happened to the market in the last few decades. When we first began to look at the ownership and control of commercial seeds in the 1970s, the mid-1970s, no single company had even 0.5% of the global commercial seed market. Not even half of 1%. We identified through FAO about 7,000 different sources of seed, public and private, around the world at that time. And this is, again, mid-70s. Today, now we're talking almost 40 years later, we see that 3 seed companies have 54% of all global commercial seed sales. And that's Monsanto, Syngenta, and DuPont. If we look at the top 10 seed companies, those companies together have about 65% of global commercial seed sales around the world. And one company, Monsanto by itself controls 27% of the global commercial seed market. So it's an enormously concentrated field from what it was 35 or 40 years ago. And there are several reasons why that's happened, one of which is intellectual property. Perhaps the more important figure to look at, though, in some ways, is if you look at the top 6 seed companies, which includes, besides Monsanto and DuPont and Syngenta, is also BASF and Bayer and Dow. If you look at those 6 together, they not only control about 60% or so of all of the seed markets themselves, but they also control about 95% of pesticide sales around the world. So they really dominate both in seeds and in pesticides. And of course, that plays to their interest in developing genetically modified crops that are herbicide tolerant. So it's a huge concentration there. Then why is that happening? One reason is because of UPOV, intellectual property rights over plant varieties. A second reason is because of the technologies that they're pursuing that are of themselves by definition highly restrictive, and that's the GM crops. A third reason is because of their political influence in general, and the ability to leverage contract arrangements, which aside from patents and aside from other regulations, really do give them a monopoly position in the marketplace that's very hard to challenge. Did you want me to say more about UPOV specifically then?
Yes, about how UPOV works.
Well, of course, in one sense it doesn't work, or they're terrible liars, one or the other. What they say is that their goal is to increase genetic diversity. Their goal is to give farmers more opportunities, to encourage more plant breeding, to bring in new species into production, and to end world hunger. Those are the goals of UPOV from established in 1964. They haven't achieved any of those goals since the 1960s. The commercial seed sector in the world has produced about 80,000 unique plant varieties, all under intellectual property protection. In that work, they've worked with about 150 crops. But if you look at it more closely, what you realize is that 59% of all of the plant varieties that they have introduced since the 1960s are actually ornamentals. So they're not there to feed people, they're there for flower arrangements and things like that. Turf grass and so on, not to feed. If you look more closely again at the varieties or the species they've worked with in terms of food even, they haven't introduced a single new species at all in these last 60 years or so. Nothing like that. They've actually narrowed the food system down to where we're really talking about anywhere from 3 to 8 crops, depending how dramatic you want to get about it, that give us almost all of our food and nutrition. As I said earlier, 45% of all of their research has been just on maize, on one crop. So they haven't diversified the species. They've narrowed the species range in our food system. They have really produced very little in terms of plant varieties, because most of them have been ornamentals even. So they haven't achieved solving the problems of world hunger, of course. Now compare that to what's happened during that same time period, since the 1960s, since UPOV began, with the peasant system. The peasant system around the world has produced and voluntarily given away to societies 2.1 million plant varieties, which they have bred themselves, nurtured themselves, and are protecting themselves, which are constantly evolving because they're in their fields. And they've given those varieties to gene banks around the world, to the public sector, so others can use them. No exclusive monopoly protection like under UPOV. Secondly, instead of narrowing the food base, those varieties, those 2.1 million varieties, are in 7,000 different species, food species. So they have diversified and continue to extend the food system. Farmers are increasingly using, in fact, crop wild relatives, so species somewhat related to our cultivated species, to bring into the food system in order to respond to climate change. So we see them actually adding to the diversity of species in this food system. So it's an enormously different approach, and UPOV has failed in every step of the way. They have not solved any of the problems they said they were going to solve, and so they've been a bit of a disaster. What they have done is, however, promote this myth that somehow innovation can only come if you provide intellectual property protection, and that they need. And the funny part there, of course, is that they need to be protected. They're saying, contrary to what capitalism normally says, which is give us a free market, what they've said is give us a monopoly market. Give us exclusive monopoly control over our plant varieties, and don't let any other varieties into the marketplace. So they've actually tried to push out the farmers' varieties out of their marketplaces so that only the patented varieties are allowed to stay in the marketplace.